Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I got it.
Dan.
All right. Thanks, Danielle. And thanks everyone for coming to this. It's too bad it's not in person. It's always easier to speak to people in person, but this is the way the world is at the moment. And I think things are changing a little bit. Anyway, Rob and Danielle and the Sioux Climate Hub asked me to talk on this subject and particularly include a little bit of work on plant hardiness zones. So I've done that. Let me just hit page down here. So today I'm going to give a little bit of a review of climate change. I suspect, given the audience here, this is stuff that's probably well known to you folks. Some implications for forests. This is work that myself and our colleagues have done. I didn't mention John Pedler. His name was on the first slide, but he's another researcher here at the Great Lakes Forestry Center who I have worked very closely with for a number of years, and he certainly deserves a shout out for this as well. We've also, through the years, been involved with updating Canada's plant hardiness zone. So I'm going to try to show some work that we've done on that, changes and prospects for the future, and a few little concluding remarks. So as Danielle has mentioned, we are a bit of a multidisciplinary team, which I feel is quite fortunate. We've been involved with a lot of work through the years, including some things that are probably not what one might expect, some of which includes actually developing historical weather and climate maps. So I'll touch on that a little bit later. But as Danielle mentioned, we do a number of things that touches many different disciplines. So somebody else wanting in. There we go. This is a pretty well-known slide, I believe, that this shows fluctuations in CO2 levels, in this case over the last 800,000 years. And at the end of the graph here, you can see how CO2 levels have gone up significantly higher than what has really happened over an 800,000 year period. In fact, I just looked up in the last week or so the latest numbers, and it appears that May of this year was reached 421 parts per million. That's the highest it's been in over 4 million years, which is quite remarkable. So past reconstructions have been based on ice core data, but currently the best CO2 monitoring occurs at the Mauna Loa Observatory on the Hawaiian Islands. And this, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric CO2 levels was about 280 parts per million. So since that time, humanity, in many respects, really the primary cause, has released about 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And obviously that's having an effect, which you all know about. So it is a significant perturbation to atmospheric CO2. And this is a graph that shows a number of different computer simulation models that give projections about possible paths in climate based on different assumptions about greenhouse gas emissions in general. Now, this is a little bit of an older graph now, but because the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has different, let's say, what's the word I'm looking for? They've improved their modeling capacity, and so they have different generations of atmospheric global climate change models. They're now called CMIP6. These were the older ones, but the main point about these graphs here is that these from about here to 1950 represents what happened in the time period recent past, and here these are projections based on different assumptions about greenhouse gas emissions developed by different modeling groups around the planet. And there's significant uncertainty in all of these things. That's just the way of the world. We can't predict these things with perfect certainty. But the thing that strikes me the most, and I think that's an important takeaway from all of this, is that starting perhaps mid-century, all of these scenarios suggest that what we're heading into is a climate at the global level that's going to surpass the experiences of the last century or so. So in Canada, you know, we have weather that changes every year, but through the course of the well, basically the next few decades, I think that if these models are correct, and so far there's been a lot of assessments of the veracity of these models, and they are at large scales very much correct in what they're predicting. So there's significant change coming, and some of the science that we do tries to assess what may happen to forests and other things of interest to humans. So let me just go on, and later on, if anybody has particular interest in these things, the scenario uncertainty, the model uncertainty, the variability within these models, we can get into that, but it's not really the point of the talk. So I wanted to say one thing, that at least for some people, they think that the IPC might be kind of representative of more extreme views, but it's not the case that the IPC is an outlier. There are a number of paleoclimatologists and others who think that things are actually possibly going to be worse than what the IPCC suggests with their models. This is a picture of James Lovelock, who passed away earlier this year. He's very well known for presenting and writing about the notion of Gaia, the Earth being in a state of stability from a climate perspective that has allowed human civilization to prosper and evolve to the state that it is. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Revenge of Gaia, in which he paints a rather pessimistic view of the state of the Earth's climate by the end of this century. So I just wanted to make that point, that at least the mainstream media doesn't necessarily pick up that the IPCC is not an outlier in its views about prospects for climate change in the coming century. Let me see here if I can do the page down here. There we go. Another thing I wanted to say is that again, depending on the audience that you're talking to, some people that think that the economists are the evil ones in this, but like any discipline, there are various views on this, and there are lots of economists these days who believe things are pretty critical, and it's time to get moving with respect to having civil society deal with greenhouse gas emissions in a significant way. JP Morgan and Chase Company had some people working out, did a report. We cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened. This book here by Gernot Wagner and Martin Wiseman was an interesting book that I read a few years ago, in which they looked at a lot of these scenarios. And one of the things they've made a point of saying that I think is, again, not necessarily well acknowledged, is that there's really a very non-trivial possibility that things could be worse than what the average outcomes suggest. So again, it means that we have to get serious about it. And of course, the picture on the bottom left here is Mark Carney, who was the chairman of or the governor of the Bank of England, and who is now the UN's, I'm not sure exactly what his title is, but he's among the things that he does, he's truly taken a personal stake in trying to help civil society deal with a changing climate, at least the financial world, let's say. And I also wanted to make a point here that human behavior and psychology is increasingly a part of scientific study. It's clear that if humanity to deal with climate change, we need to address how we think about climate change and how different people think about climate change. So some interesting work that I read are things that involve behavioral economics and the heuristics and biases that people have embedded in the thinking. It's not necessarily that it's bad per se, but it's how we think. So as a civilization, I think we have to understand how these things influence our thinking. There's a list of them down here below. I think the world of forestry, I think, I've never written anything about this, but I think possibly suffers from this whole idea about hyperbolic discounting, which really means kind of a fancy way of saying that we really are super heavily focused on the very near term. And that's a challenge when it comes to dealing with climate change, because climate change is often seen to be something that's a long way off, but it's not, and it's something that is very important for future generations. That's what the problem is. It's trying to keep the planet in a state that future generations can live in a way that we would want them to live. So anyway, a couple of little pontifications on my part about some of the science that's going on and perspectives on climate change these days. So here's a report that, for those of you who don't know about this one, this is a really good report that Environment Canada put out about Canada particularly, what's happening in Canada as compared to other parts of the world, but also drilling down into regional changes. A couple of the next slides are draw on this report. It's available online. It's a good report. There are some of the things that they show, and some of the tools that are out there now for people to look at and get a bit of a better sense of what might happen for their own place, which I think is important also for people to think about, are maps and figures like this. So this is something that comes from Canada's Climate Atlas, and it just shows different scenarios. You can do a query and it'll show you, what the past weather climate has been and what may be happening in the future. So the historical stuff is actually some of the models that we've developed about Canada's past weather. So we're pleased that that work has been done. What they do is they use the historical record to help calibrate and their downscaling of the global circulation models. But it shows in this case that Sault Ste. Marie has an average annual temperature of about 4.5 degrees, and the projection for the 2050 to 2080 period is that it goes up to 8.9 degrees. That's remarkable, actually. In fact, I think it's kind of hard to imagine. So one of the things that we've done in the context of actually forest genetics is develop a program that allows us to compare climate similarities across landscapes. So for this talk, John and I did a little mapping exercise where we basically picked Sault Ste. Marie as the location, and we asked the question, where would the climate in the year 2050, about 2050, be similar to? And so you can see the average annual temperature currently, this little dark reddish orangish band here, shows where that average temperature is across landscapes now. But by the period of this period, 2040 to 2050, under the 8.5 climate change scenario, suggests that that climate is more like this, where this red band is now. And that's down, near Detroit, Ohio, places like that. So pretty drastic change. It doesn't necessarily mean that one gets all the good weather that happens down in that part of the world. It's a very drastic change to the ecosystems, agricultural productivity, plant and animal life, all those sorts of things that are really not used to that sort of quick of a change that's in the prospects for occurring. And like I said, so far, these types of models seem to be pretty good at these large spatial scales in terms of saying what could happen. Okay, so here's another way of thinking about some of this stuff. So this is showing what might happen with respect to return times for more sort of extreme temperatures. So what under the more, let's say, optimistic greenhouse gas emission scenario, this graph here shows that what would be 50-year extreme events would be happening maybe on a 15 to 10-year time return interval by the time we reach really, I guess in this case, it's the 2020s, 2030s. So we're not that far away. I think we see it. BC this week has been experiencing extreme temperatures. It is happening in a statistically significant way. And even one of the things that's happening, we all know that about Hurricane Fiona that happened to the East Coast. people are working on statistical models that are trying to assess the likelihood of that event happening to that magnitude under these sort of greenhouse gas scenarios that are happening now. So, and you can see that under the higher here on the right-hand side, the higher greenhouse gas emission scenarios, this 8.5 scenario, the return intervals are even shorter. So, you know, there's good likelihood, good probability, it's not a definitive thing, that extreme temperatures that we get will be occurring much more rapidly in the future. So you can also look at precipitation, you can look at a number of things on these websites. Precipitation is a harder thing to model, and it's much more variable. And I think the big concern about that, even though there's it looks like the average amounts maybe not seem to be too different. It's in this case is up about 10%. It's the return intervals and the extreme events that are of more concern, and how, for example, agricultural crops can deal with drought periods and heavy rain periods, those sorts of things. I'll skip that. So here I was going to start to get into a little bit about what it might mean for large landscapes and things like forests, which a number of you think about and deal with. So this is a few maps that show maps of dryness. So this is work that stems from some scientists that were in the Canadian Forest Service's Edmonton lab, a fellow named Ted Hogg and also Dave Price, who worked out a dryness index that takes into account rainfall and temperature and potential evapotranspiration. And this little, on this top left, this is sort of the current period that we are living in now. And this red area shows basically, whoops, backwards there, the prairie zone. And his dryness index actually was very good at explaining the boreal transition zone in the prairies. So what's happening through time is that this dry area is increasing significantly. And I think that it's fair to say that people who monitor these forests over large landscapes using remote sensing technologies and on the ground observations are seeing that, in fact, this dryness is increasing, as would be predicted. Climate change is sort of moving from west to east, and you can see on these maps that the redder areas are increasing significantly through time. So this is the sort of this map on the top right is the 2011 to 2040 period. And then you can see it becomes even redder in the mid-century and redder still as we go forward to the latter part of the century. Again, these are not definitive because much depends on how humanity deals with greenhouse gas emissions. It's one of the reasons why there's a big effort to focus on, quote, decarbonizing our society and using things other than fossil fuels for our energy sources. So what does it mean for forests? Well, here's some images of some of the impacts that can happen as we become more volatile and things can warm up. You get drought, it causes real problems across forest landscapes. It can affect forest health. We get both growth declines and growth increases. In some cases, the growing season length will increase, but we may get things like late spring frosts. We can get mortality. It can affect the phenology of plants. We get more extreme wind events. This past summer, there was a derocher. I'm not quite sure I have the right word. It's something that's new to Canada, but happens in parts of the southern US, just real extreme wind events, not necessarily tornadoes that can have wreak havoc on forest landscapes as well. So, and another big concern is the reproductive capacity of forest landscapes. So things like the flowering of male and female flowers in tree species, how they will react to different weather conditions that are occurring through time. So, you know, one of the big areas of effort now within the Canadian Forest Service is a kind of revamping of the National Tree Seed Center, which is actually on the head of that center, Donnie McPhee, is on a cross-country tour trying to promote the whole idea of getting more people involved in seedling seed monitoring, seed collections, and helping with the Canadian Forest Service's 2 billion tree program. So we often forget about seed as just kind of a little thing, but it's what you need to start our forests. And that's another thing that some people are quite concerned about with respect to a rapidly changing climate. Wildfires. Ontario experienced a very, I guess you could say, good year, because there were very few fires in Ontario this past year. Last year was a terrible year for fires out west. We've done some work where we've taken the dryness index that I talked about a little while ago and correlated it to wildfire area burn through time. And we got very good correlations with that work. We wrote a paper on it. Emily Hope here in my group was the lead author on that, Wildfire Suppression Costs for Canada Under a Changing Climate. But what these graphs show in a kind of a interesting way here is the projections of increases in fire over what we would expect to be the bad years currently. So these dashed lines that you see across the bottom of these graphs here, here's Ontario, show anything above these lines here are the worst, let's say 3, 4, 5 years in a 30-year period. So you can see right here, there are very few, which we'd expect. But going forward, the dryness index would suggest that wildfires are going to be much more problematic. It's going to be challenging for agencies to develop policies and suppression tactics. It's going to be a challenge, again, with dryness occurring in the way that we think it could occur because of increases in temperature and more volatility in rainfall. So that is a particular concern to me, and there are researchers that deal with that sort of thing. Canadian Forest Service is trying to increase capacity in the wildfire science, so stay tuned for that sort of work. So here's the plant hardiness stuff, which I'm sure many of you are gardeners. When I started my career, one of the things that I did was develop climate models, spatial climate models. I'm not a climatologist. I've learned quite a bit over the years, but what we need if we want to understand the role of climate is we have to be able to figure out, well, correlate, if you like, things like the productivity of plants and animals, the distribution of plants and animals as it relates to past climate. So we needed to develop maps of past climate in order to do that. So so we did that, and in fact, I work very closely with Environment Canada folks, and they use our models. We get requests all the time to give people estimates of climate at their research locations. Just this past week, I had an interesting call with a Canadian Urban Health Network, people that were in the Department of Health Sciences at University of Toronto, University of Victoria, who correlate human health to weather and climate. So what they're going to get us to do is provide them estimates of a range of different climate variables at some 8 million postal codes across the country. And from that, they're able to do things like what we do here for plants, and to look at things like the health of humans in relation to extreme weather conditions. So for us in plant hardiness, what this means is that we're trying to look at the distribution of plants and animals as it relates to past climate. So one of the things we do, we make maps of the hardiness zones of the country. All that is a formula that provides us with an index value that is the well-known Canadian hardiness zones. A little bit more sophisticated science is we can gather observations, and there's lots of little gray dots on this map here, and those are occurrences of something, let's say white pine. And because we have these climate models, we could get estimates at all those locations. And you can see here there are some cases where there are dots far from where the concentrated dots are. So it doesn't mean that these trees can't survive in those locations. And there are places where people put them in arboretums, which is important information. So we've gathered literally millions of these records from across North America to develop what we call climate envelope models. We've got this data from non-government organizations, citizen scientists, other government agencies, and we make maps of the climatic habitat or the climatic tolerances of literally thousands of plant species. So we've done that for pretty well all the trees of North America. And you get maps like this. Is what you see here is some green and a bit of an orangey brown color. And that just shows the climate that matches all these locations. So, and what we can do is we can take the projections and basically show where that climate, we know the climate that we know these plants are happy with, where that will move in the century, during the course of this coming century. So we've done that. And one of the things that we found is that for the major tree species of North America, that the climate habitat is looking like it's going to shift northward by more than 700 kilometers by the end of this century. That's huge. We're not saying that these trees are going to actually migrate there. There's no way they do. Historically, the migration rates are more like 10 to 50 kilometers per century. But this does suggest that it's going to be difficult for trees probably to adjust. It's going to possibly be difficult for trees to maintain their reproductive processes that would occur in nature naturally. And we've done some work that shows that these climate envelopes have already shifted about 60 kilometers in the last 50 years. But these climate change scenarios do suggest that there's going to be an increase in the rapidity of this change over the next few decades. So again, not to be too pessimistic, but there's certainly change afoot. But the plant hardiness zones themselves are things that I think we all know. If we're all gardeners, I'm a gardener. I think we all like gardening. Well, apparently it's the most favorite pastime of Canadians. We've done some work that shows that it's actually changed significantly. So this map on the left side here was sort of the map of the Canadian hardiness zones done by the original work of the Agriculture Canada scientists. And this is the map that we did in the last, about 10 years ago or so, representing the climate for the 1981 to 2010 period. And you can see just visually that it's significantly changed in terms of the hardiness zones. It's really increased in the west, less so in the east. And I'll get into that in a second. And this is the nice map that we ultimately produced that you might see in garden shops. And yeah, I like to think that, well, this is actually our work, and some of this stuff we give permission to people to use it in garden catalogs. And I think Home Depot even sent out a blast of images of this map to their email list. So it's a well-known basically tool that people use to help figure out what can grow where. So this shows changes. And again, as I said, the west is warming much more quickly than the east. That's well known. This is what's expected. The east, in some cases, there has been very little, if any, change. Here's Ontario. There are lots of areas that have increased into higher zones. One place declined. The thing to know about these Canadian plant hardiness zones is that they're a function of 7 different climate variables. It's not just all about temperature. It's about rain during the growing season, the minimum temperature of the coldest month, the hottest temperature of the warmest month, rain in January, which is an important thing. Rain in January is not a good thing for plants, because if there's not enough snow cover, the roots can get frozen and death can occur. So there is going to be spatial variation in how these changes basically result in changes in the zone across the entire country. And here are just some changes that show what's happened to particular municipalities. Kelowna has gone from 6B to 7A, Sault Ste. Marie from 4A to 5A, Toronto 6A to 7A, Charlottetown 5A to 5B. So all this information is available online at that planthardiness.gc.ca. But just to complicate the story a little bit, the US has another approach to doing hardiness zones. They use a single variable of extreme minimum temperature. We have also used that because There's some garden centers, some nurseries that actually use the USDA index. So just to have both, we have actually done this work with our climate modeling to map out these values through time, again from the 1931 to 60 period to the 1981 to 2010 period. And again, got a nice map that's available. If anybody wants one, you can give me an email after and we can get you a poster. But what this map shows is that, in fact, the extreme minimums have actually gone down a little bit on the East Coast. That's very counterintuitive, but what's happening there is we're getting icebergs, more icebergs spawning from the Arctic that are coming down and cooling the eastern seaboard somewhat. So, you know, a little bit more of a counterintuitive kind of result that one wouldn't necessarily expect. But you can see here again that the warming is occurring very much on the west side of the country and going and less so further east, which is exactly what was expected and predicted by these climate change scenarios that the IPCC puts out. All this stuff is written up in an article that we published in a journal called Bioscience, called Change and Evolution in Plant Hardiness Zones of Canada. I was kind of hoping that we'd actually have some newer maps that we could I could actually give you folks the first preview of, but we're not quite ready yet, that will use the latest 30-year averages for the plant hardiness zones, the 1991 to 2020 period. An important thing to remember with these hardiness zones is that they're average conditions, not individual year values. So every year is different when it comes to weather, and that's one of the things that we're actually seeing, is that there's significant volatility, and is one of the reasons why people can't just try things that, you know, growing palms in or peach trees in Sault Ste. Marie. In fact, a number of years ago, somebody did and was successful, but apparently that tree is now has died. So volatility in weather will affect things. Things like hardiness zones are just examples of maps of average conditions. They're not predictions of individual weather, individual year weather. So just maybe to finish up here, I want to say that Canada, including Ontario, is projected to experience increased temperatures, generally higher precipitation, and more extreme weather over the course of this century. Warmness could outpace wetness at times. It's going to affect trees and forests. It's going to challenge forest managers. It's going to challenge people who are interested in growing gardens and farmers that are growing food for us. There's a lot of science that's happening. I think that we're going to definitely face significant challenges. And an important part of that is actually how we think. And I do think groups like yourself are a critical part of raising awareness and helping people think about every little bit that they can do is an important thing when it comes to dealing with the changing climate. Hardiness zones have changed. They're going to continue to evolve. That's not a surprise. Volatility in weather, though, will mean that we're not going to be growing palm trees in Sault Ste. Marie anytime soon. But I think gardeners will experiment, as they love to do, with plants that may not have seen the light of day 30 years ago, but look like they can survive now for a period of time in Sault Ste. Marie. There are lots of science tools that are increasingly available. They're not necessarily going to solve the problem of climate change per se, but they might help with adaptation efforts that civil society can do to deal with the changing climate on our ecosystems and our agricultural systems. But I think it's fair to say that definitely the world needs a shift to a low carbon economy to basically reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a level that will result in an outcome that is not like the more severe climate emission paths that I showed earlier in the talk, because that's definitely going into a land, well, basically will push the world into a climate that is not good for civil society. So I guess I'll leave it at that. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them. I guess there's a couple of the chat has two things in it. I can open that up if you want, Danielle. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. So yeah, you could
Okay.
definitely start addressing the ones in the chat if you'd like.
Yep. Okay, so Abby says, are we really 5A? My worry is that updated zones don't reflect increasing variability. So overall, our zone may be warmer, but we still have killing frosts as late as June 15th. So yes, that's a good point. And that's what I'm saying. 5A is a reflection of average conditions over a 30-year period. So it depends on the level of risk that one wants to take with respect to things like growing plants. You might be successful for a few years, but not necessarily down the road or in the longer run. But at the same time, nurseries, I believe, have also been fairly conservative. I know, for example, there were some people that tried to get some horse chestnut trees here. I know because I was involved in this a few years ago, but the nursery said, oh, I'm not going to do that because they're not, they don't grow here. But in fact, I know they grow here. I've got some in my neighbor put some, a scientist who worked here at the lab, put some in, and they're growing quite well. Outside of what would be seen to be its natural range. So things do grow outside their natural range, forests do, but from a let's say an industrial point of view, or let's say an agricultural crop production point of view, I believe that farmers are generally conservative. They're not going to necessarily want to take large risks until they see that there's a little less volatility within the parameters that they need for a particular crop to survive. Same thing for trees. So hopefully that, I think we're kind of agreeing there, Abby, but and it's maybe a bit of semantics, but definitely volatility is an important thing, or variability. Yeah. So I don't know. Let me see if there's another one there. I guess that's it. No, the next was
Yeah.
just a comment about moose being able to handle hot weather, and definitely, yeah, how it's not just plants that are going to be affected by this. Absolutely, it's yeah, I mean, we see this with respect to things like ticks moving northward and other basically changes in the distribution and productivity and relative abundance of not just plants but animals too. So there's definitely some challenges. What are your thoughts about assisted migration moving trees to follow the zone changes? Well, that's that's a good question. In fact, that's very much what myself and John spend a lot of time working with or working on. We have done some work that makes use of forest genetics trials, where people have taken populations of trees that have grown in across different ranges of their entire distributions, and we've looked at the role of climate in productivity and growth, and we work with people in the Ontario Minister of Natural Resources. Penjing Liu is a geneticist with them, and we do things like uh, assess how far can you move seeds in order to, well, before you start losing significant productivity. We actually helped the MNR change their seed zones this past year. And one of the things that we found was that you could actually move seed sources 400 to 500 kilometers at least before you're going to probably lose productivity. However, again, there's some issues with respect to volatility and variability in extreme weather. Late spring frost has been mentioned, so one needs to be somewhat conservative on that, but the changes in the zones did try to reflect that conservative sort of view. But at the same time, you also want forests that are going to be resilient and thrive in the middle part of the century, because our forests hopefully last for decades. So it is definitely a challenge, but I think that personally, I think that assisted migration, depending on the details of what you mean by it, is something that needs to be thought about and is being thought about by the forestry profession. Hopefully that answers your question, Judy.
If there's any other questions, like feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah.
I guess just to sort of piggyback on Judy's question, if we don't undertake like widespread migration, and considering what you said about how the trees aren't really going to be able to move that fast on their own, what do you think the forest around the Sioux will look like in, say, 2070, in like a tangible way for people who live here? Do you think it will all be kind of dying?
Oh, I certainly hope not. I mean, and I
Yeah.
think trees, uh, I think trees are fairly resilient. One thing about the migration problem too is that all this work that I've showed you is all about climate. It's nothing to do with soils. A lot of the trees that are, you know, from more southern realms, they're not going to be able to tolerate the soil conditions of the boreal shield, right? So we're not going to be able to move shagbark hickory up to the you know, Wawa and expect it to do well. So I guess that for this part of the world, I think that we are going to probably continue to, because of the Great Lakes, we're going to probably continue to have a relatively wet landscape, that these forests here probably will, in a relative sense, do okay. We want to hope that there aren't recurring fires, which, you know, there haven't been in our landscape. It's not like parts of the West where if we start to get more frequent fires, there isn't going to be a seed source for in a natural setting for those forests to regenerate. So again, it depends on where you are as far as what the forest might look like in another 50 to 100 years.
Okay,
I
thank
think there's a
you.
couple more. I don't know. I feel like being a bit of a pessimist here right now, but there's a
No,
certain
no.
reality to this stuff
Yeah.
that's I think true. Um, okay, I'm just going to try to find. Okay. For those of us who are interested in growing native wildfires, do you think there's merit to growing more southern Ontario wild species here, or stick to what's historically grown in Algoma? Well, if you're talking about your own garden, then I mean it's a little bit of of a um, a personal preference. Um, I think that, as you've noted before, that variations in variations in weather at certain times could cause mortality to some of these plants. So, but the only way you're going to find out is if you're going to do it, unless you're, you know, uh, you've kind of taken a keen interest and you know a lot about a particular species. But I mean, gardeners are notorious for trying things, and it's understandable because I think that's what humans do. They try things. Um, and that sort of thing, if it's native to Ontario, further south, then it's a little different than the ethics of, let's say, a species that's not native to North America that you're coming in and trying to plant, which I think I think there was a question about invasive species a little bit further down below. Is it a good idea to remove invasive species, tree species like Norway maple to help native species? So yeah, definitely. You know, Norway maple is not a native tree, and it has issues associated with it. It's been widely planted. So I think it's kind of gone out of favor, certainly in some circles, but still is widely available and used, and is a high proportion of urban landscapes, urban street trees. So I certainly would encourage people to use native species as much as they can, rather than non-native species that have certain attributes, traits like what Norway maple does. So, from a personal preference point of view, yeah, Norway maple is not one that I would recommend. Um, Evergreens in the forest burn very well. Is there any thought to increasing the amount of deciduous to reduce the fire hazard? Well, in fact, the relative abundance, so that the amount of conifer to hardwood is actually changing, and it is becoming more. There are more, in a relative sense, I believe, hardwoods than there has been historically. But again, it varies across the country. But and in fact, there is a kind of there are wildfire strategies, wildfire, sorry, um, there are strategies out there to try to decrease the risks to communities with respect to that are surrounded by forests, to try to create buffers and change the density of the landscapes to with respect to how much conifer there is in there. So this is stuff that is increasingly becoming known and promoted to help northern and remote communities. What else? Given projected dry, will our southern Ontario become prairie? Well, that is possible. I think that's going to take a longer period of time. The southern Ontario forest, there's again, in a relative sense, there's not as much of it at all now, so it might be more protected, more highly managed. But definitely, there are some parts of the southern Ontario landscape that will be threatened. Species like oaks have deep taproots. Even white pine is another species that has a very large north to south gradient that suggests that it will be more tolerant to hotter conditions. In fact, we know it is because it grows very, very well down in the parts of the southern U.S. So again, it depends on the species. I think one of the things that people talk about is there probably going to be different communities, different assemblages of tree species than what might what has happened currently. Okay, I think I've got another. We've got 5 more.
Should we jump to Rob? He had his hand up, but I
oh, okay.
think he's
Rob
down now. Rob,
great talk, Dan. Yeah, you just answered my question. It was with regard to whether you think, or maybe you might want to comment a little more about novel plant communities. You've shown climate envelopes. That's one aspect, but their ability of different species, different taxonomic groups to migrate will also vary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That's one of the things. These are sort of one of the challenges too, is how will these, what will happen, because it is novel, that we're entering climates that are that have not been sort of experienced in a stable way through time. So you might have seen on the map, oops, hang on. So here, there are examples of species. So on the Plant Hardiness website, you can pick any of these 3,000 species and you can see what happens. And I'll just note, I don't know if I said it, that we've got kind of 2 versions of these maps. I call them maps for ecologists and maps for gardeners. The maps for gardeners are just based on temperatures, based on the idea that, well, gardeners can add water, and they do, right? So, but one of the things that you see in here is quite often is that the area of green, which is technically it's the area that plant species is most used to from all the observations that we have, right? So this area of green often for many species decreases significantly. So what's that saying is that we're getting patterns of novel climates across the landscape as we go forward. So we've got precipitation happening in a different combination to the temperature through time. And so, I don't know how exactly these tree species are going to, or any of these plant species are going to respond, but what we can say is that it's entering a climate domain that it's not used to. Okay, and there are no parts of and that's, I'm going to say, is going to cause stress and a fair amount of uncertainty with respect to how forests will respond. So, okay, now I'm just going to go
maybe just one more comment on that, Dan.
Yeah.
Are you also looking at migration potential of different species? That's their best ability to travel?
Indeed, we are, and there are lots of people that do that. Actually, myself and John published a paper within the last year or so with some U.S. Forest Service folks on that exact topic. Also, Isabelle Aubin, who's a scientist here, and Laura Boisvert-Marsh, who's also works here at the Great Lakes Forestry Center. She just finished her PhD doing exactly that sort of thing, looking at actual species migration. But again, what it shows is actually, that the plants can't migrate as quickly as the climate is migrating. So that's a pretty, expected outcome. But it puts a little bit of a reality bent on this kind of work too, for people who think that, oh, we're just going to let the plants follow the climate, but it doesn't really work like that. Even in mountainous zones, if I was giving a talk out west, we'd show species that, you know, you think can move up the mountains, but they can't move that quickly. So they're not going to be able to follow the climatic changes that are happening very easily, that's for sure, without human inputs. Okay, let me see. Evergreens and forest burn weather. Okay, so I did that. Hang on, sorry. A comment. Very difficult for members to understand why we aren't changing how we manage forests. Yes. Well, I think it's difficult. I actually think, you know, the best thing we can do for forests is try to keep them as healthy as we can now, because there's a lot of uncertainty with this stuff in terms of an exact path of climate, how it's going to project. So do whatever we can to keep forests healthy. And what we found with some of the work that we've done is that mixing species seems to help with respect to productivity. But again, that's a bit of a, that was more in a southern Ontario context than what's going to happen up here in more northern areas. Oops. Let's see. Isn't assisted migration equivalent to creating invasive species? Well, good question from Carmen there. Again, it depends on what one means by assisted migration. If you're really interested, I can point you and give you some papers on the subject. So there's stuff like range expansion. You're on the edge of a range of a species. We're not introducing new species to a continent necessarily. That's not what's being talked about here. This is talking about moving the seed sources that may come from more southern areas that are likely to going to, you know, in the past, the approach to regenerating forests was to use local seed, because that's what local seed was genetically adapted to local climate. But local climate is not local climate anymore. So if you don't move the seed sources to the climate that it's expected to get, that it's used to, then you can expect some maladaptation. So that's in many cases what is meant by assisted migration. It's assisted migration of the population, the genetics of a particular species. So again, that's there's some nuance to that, Carmen. And like I say, if you're really interested, I can send you a paper or two on the subject. People think we should be making more adjustment to forest management, but that isn't that easy. Yes, that's right, Mark. I think I just agree with you. Okay, how can we volunteer to help with climate change initiatives? So, yeah, well, join the Climate Hub from Sault Ste. Marie. Danielle, put a plug in. Yeah. White pine even grows in northern Georgia. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, white pine is a great tree. And of course, for those of you who don't know, white pine is Ontario's official tree. It's truly a magnificent tree. Yes. Yeah. Okay. What do you think about Dr. Raymond Wheeler's climate cycle theory? I have to say I'm not entirely familiar with that, so I probably shouldn't comment on it. I'm going to guess that it's something to do with, you know, the world evolves with the climate is evolving and some of this is natural. That's true to a point, but I think that there's pretty strong evidence that the kind of climate changes that we've seen here are really very much based on human greenhouse gas emissions. As I said at the beginning, the amount of CO2 that's been put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution far exceeds what was happening in the 6,000 years or more preceding that. There have been times when CO2 levels in the Earth's atmosphere were much higher. At that 4 to 4.5 million time period that I mentioned, sea levels were 5 to 25 meters higher. That would inundate all the many, not all, but many of the modern cities around the globe. And it's the rapidity of the change that's so significant. and of concern. So I'm not sure if that's at all what you were kind of referring to, but there's a shot at some of that. All right. A few thank yous, and thanks for listening and letting me yabber on here a little bit, probably more than you wanted to hear, but it's nice to talk. It's too bad it wasn't in a room where we would all be able to sit and see each other in person, because I think it's a lot easier to talk. It's certainly easier for me to talk to people when they're in the same room, not the same looking at a screen.
That's fair. Just to like finish off, I'll let you go, but do you have sort of a call to action that you often say to people who are interested? I mean, we already had that great question about volunteering, but like personal action versus advocacy, like anything that comes to mind. I'm kind of putting you in the spot, but just if you have anything at the top of your head.
Well, I guess I hadn't thought of this before, but I would say, yeah, take it seriously and have respectful conversations. If you've got some people that deny, I mean, I actually, because I guess I'm interested in human behavior. I've got 3 kids. I'm still married. Psychology is very much a part of the climate change issue, and we have to figure out how to get. We're never going to get everybody bought into this, but we have to get enough people bought into it that it helps to change the path of emissions at large scales. So how do you do that? I guess it does mean some political involvement, asking, trying to raise awareness and asking people that are running for offices in you know, I guess at all levels of government, to, you know, what their opinions are, and hopefully they are open to thinking about it, truly thinking about it. So I would think that that's an important thing. Somebody has to do it. They're tough decisions. There's no doubt about that, because there are trade-offs with everything. But I think most people would say that we want the planet to be livable. And I didn't say it at the beginning, but James Lovelock thinks that, or thought that, he was a big advocate for nuclear power, which I'm not sure that I am, but he said that by the end of the century, we'll be living in a climate of hell and billions will die. I hope he was wrong. But there are people that are a lot more pessimistic than others about the path that we're heading on. So I do think it's important for people to treat it seriously, and but at the same time have optimism and hope that we can do it, because the worst thing that we could do is give up.
That's awesome. Okay, sorry, I'm cutting in it, but hopefully I'm not cutting you off. Yeah, I think that's a great way to sort of finish off. And yeah, I'll just lastly mention that that links with your answer really well, is that our municipal elections are coming up at the end of October. And we have sent out a questionnaire to all of our Algoma candidates, asking them about their environmental views. And if you're someone who lives in Algoma and you're hoping to, or you should be aiming to vote at the end of October, reach out to your candidates and see if they've responded to this survey, and then look for our, we're going to publish their responses in the next maybe week and a half. So you can look out for those and make an environmentally informed vote if you choose to do so. And then our next webinar is, I believe, October 26th, and that will be hopefully from someone from Algoma Steel to talk about their electric arc furnace and whatnot, but that's not fully confirmed yet. But the date is, so October 26th will be our next webinar. And I think that's also, just thank you again so much, Dan. That was a wonderful talk, and we had such good engagement there at the end, so that's wonderful. Thank you for everyone for asking questions, and yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again. And if anybody wants any papers or anything like that, then, you know, it's quite okay to reach out to Danielle and Rob or whatever. They can get in touch with me. We all work at the same place, so it's not a problem. Okay.
Yeah, we can get in contact for sure. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.